For over 44 months, Russia is waging war against Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Room. Today we are going to analyze three key focal points of the Russian military campaign: the ongoing situation in Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region and the strategic Zaporizhzhia triangle with Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk. We will also look at the Kharkiv region, where Russia keeps sending soldiers over the Russian-Ukrainian border, keeping the pressure high. We begin in Pokrovsk and first take a look at the situation as it was 3 weeks ago. That was 3 weeks ago when we started our last broadcast here. And we're taking a closer look now, zooming in on the eastern part of Ukraine in, as I said, one of the major hotspots. And we'll pause this right here to see the situation on the 6th. October was already relatively difficult for the Ukrainian army. We see that we have these areas where they made very significant and rapid territorial advances, pushing the front line considerably further to the north in an extremely short time frame, where, however, Ukraine, and we can see this from these blue markings, has done a great deal, has also committed a lot of troops in order to end this breakthrough towards the north, and thus also the threat of encirclement for Kramatorsk and Sloviansk a bit further north. And we can also see further successes achieved in recent weeks. However, we also see, and this is the huge problem we have, this a semicircle that has closed in around the twin cities of Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad, so around these more than 100,000 inhabitants who once lived there. And while truly dramatic news reaches us from Pokrovsk this morning, we first want to discuss the situation of the last days and weeks, where Russia has attempted to push forward and essentially complete this encirclement, penetrating into all the small towns in the surrounding area, for instance Rudinska, located up here in the northern sector, to further close this circle around Pokrovsk. Let's go ahead and play the animation now and see what has happened over the last 3 weeks, and we can observe there are some notable differences. For one, as I already hinted at earlier, here in the north, where the blue areas have grown, where the Russians were able to be pushed out from some sections. However, and this is precisely the huge problem, we see that the contested areas have developed here around Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad, meaning they have shifted further to the west. And we also see, most importantly, that the fighting has extended here into the city center. That means the orange area we're seeing, that's the contested area. It shows us that by now there is fighting in the center of Pokrovsk, and this morning at least it looks the same in the northern districts. As I said, we're examining this in detail, beginning with Rudinska, a suburb which previously had around 10,000 inhabitants, where fighting is also currently going on. And based on the footage we have here now, compiled from both Russian and Ukrainian perspectives, you can actually get a really clear picture of what's unfolding on the ground there. First, we're seeing footage from the Russian propaganda channel War Gonzo, which shows us how such an infiltration, or the actual way Russian troops are advancing into a place like Rudinska, really looks like on the ground. As I said, always with a population over 10,000. We see it's actually just 2 Russian soldiers marching through the forest here. We see these soldiers marching through the forests and the fields around the outside, and then, however, actually reaching the first houses. And we saw it, this is the huge problem. There is no resistance, there are no Ukrainian fighters. Let's just stop here for a moment. Neither Ukrainian fighters occupying or holding positions or trenches or similar around Rudinska, nor Ukrainian fighters who would have just ended up taking shelter inside the city's large multi-story residential apartment blocks. We observed that the path they took came from the southeast. Initially it went directly past these garages that we could see there. These particular garages were for the residents back then, and then into one of these houses. And the fundamental problem for the Ukrainians is that they simply lack the necessary infantry to defend these houses. And so we also see how these recordings are made, which we're about to see next. This stormtrooper unit, maybe the same ones we just saw, maybe 2 different ones. Ultimately, it's really only a few Russian soldiers who, however, are crossing the front line at dozens of places simultaneously, if you can even still call it a front line, and are infiltrating the Ukrainian-held towns. We are now seeing these recordings of the Russians, which are, of course, meant to prove from a Russian perspective, yes. So we seized the center, we took control of this school here, and we eventually wound up somewhere in Rudinska. That too, as I said, all footage from Rudinska, and we're controlling the area. In reality, it's completely different. We saw it in the first footage. These are 2 Russian soldiers, or maybe even 10 times 2 Russian soldiers who entered a village somewhere. And in that sense, it's not so difficult for the Ukrainians to defend themselves against them as long as there are only a few. We're now seeing a BTR-4 of the Ukrainian armed forces approaching one of these occupied houses. We can also see again, just as seen before, that the garages are located entirely outside the city, and here are the first residential blocks within the city. And we can now see how this BTR-4 moves into position and then fires at the Russians who have just entrenched themselves in this building there. And as long as it's only a few Russian soldiers, it helps the Ukrainians rather well to hold against them again and again, to keep pushing in, to keep killing the Russians who are there. However, it's not just a few soldiers, but rather tens of thousands of soldiers doing this, coming again and again every day. And over time, you get the situation. We see the footage from inside and outside this BTR-4. So the situation is that Russian soldiers are present in such large numbers that they can even bring up their logistics, meaning they are supplying anti-tank weapons, that they're bringing up drones, that they're bringing up mines, which are then being deployed right here throughout these local streets. That it's simply an overwhelming force that they're building up over time with these very small groups, and at some point the Ukrainians just can't put up a fight against it anymore. These BTR we're seeing here, for instance, destroyed by drones, and the entire city eventually falling under Russian control. And as sad as it is, it's a picture we keep seeing, one we've also seen in places like Ocheritain, in Avdiivka, in Bakhmut and so on. We've seen it again and again, always the same. The Russians were there first with a few soldiers. The Ukrainians drove in with their tanks and started shooting at them. But they simply don't have the manpower, they don't have the number of soldiers, the Ukrainians, to bring these buildings back under control afterwards. So basically, after this mission is over, search and destroy, that means search and destroy, the BTR-4 drives back out again. And the Russians, the survivors, stay there and are reinforced by a few more every day, which eventually leads to the entire city being under Russian control. So if there are successful Ukrainian counter-operations, and there definitely are, we just saw it in that blue area, then those must be very, very small towns, where you really only need to kill, wound, or capture a few Russians in order to then recapture those towns. And this all happened, we'll look at it on the map shortly, in Suketska. There, I believe it was the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, if I'm not mistaken, of the Ukrainian armed forces that just recaptured this small village. And they only had about 10 of their own soldiers, and they killed some Russians, and we'll see it at the end, captured about 4, because of course the Russians also have this serious and ongoing manpower problem and are only ever able to send in very small groups as their reinforcements. That means the only chance for the Ukrainians to recapture entire villages, so to speak, is that these villages are so small that you only need to capture or kill a few Russians there, and then you yourself only need to leave a handful of your own soldiers to have this village back under your own control. We're now seeing drone footage here showing the Russian soldiers who are surrendering here in the area of Suketska. These are only isolated pieces of footage we are seeing, which clearly show the Ukrainians' small-scale counterattacks, and these efforts are proving to be effective as we now observe the captured soldiers being led away from the area. And they are only being successful in those areas where you can actually drive out all the Russians. As long as Russian forces remain present in these areas and continue to survive the Ukrainian counteroffensives, these cities just keep getting redder on our map, meaning they are increasingly under Russian control. Let's take another detailed look at the overall situation to gain a proper understanding of the current developments and to clearly recap what we've just been observing, which is, on the one hand, as already stated, Rodinske, which is highly threatened now by Russians here, and the other was Suketska, a small place that was roughly here next to Fedorivka, so also in the area where the Ukrainians have advanced further. Now we're taking a look at some new footage from near Kharkiv, and Kharkiv is currently something that the Russians consider extremely important to capture. And interestingly, the Russians are using a different strategy there. Sakova is also visible in this area, and it's extremely important for pushing this advance further to the north in this direction. There, the Russians are implementing the tactic of launching attacks with large tank columns over the past several days in an effort to seize Kharkiv. And of course, the Russians' hope was based on the fact that the poor weather conditions currently prevent the Ukrainian drone operators from being able to defend against it. However, as we can now see from the footage, they are indeed still capable of doing so. And as we're looking at all this footage, we see that these are actually shots we essentially hadn't seen at all throughout the entire summer, namely large Russian tank columns, all of them extremely modified. And here we see it again, so extremely. Up-armored tanks and armored personnel carriers, specifically of the BTR, BMP, and also T-72 types and so on, which were all built specifically to transport infantry inside them. That means this actual purpose of tanks or armored personnel carriers to advance rapidly and to become active themselves. The original role of actual combat has almost disappeared. They are now essentially just armored buses that Russia has converted to transport infantry from point A to point B, without being immediately destroyed. As mentioned, we'll take a quick look at the footage and see that the Russians managed to gather probably 29 tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that day together, which then partially managed to drive towards Kharkiv and the neighboring village, but were subsequently attacked, and according to the Ukrainian reports, a final total of 12 of the Russian vehicles were ultimately destroyed in the engagement. Which means, however, that a large part managed to turn back after they had dropped off the infantry. What we don't show so much is the footage of how they then proceed to actually attack this infantry. We've completely cut them out because you mustn't forget, of course, that each of these tanks and infantry fighting vehicles drops off about 5 to 10 soldiers. And they hide in the woods, conceal themselves in the ruins of these villages, and are then subsequently attacked by the Ukrainian forces in those locations. There too. The majority of the soldiers sent in are killed, but not every last one. And that's precisely the problem for the Ukrainians, because the Russians are managing to slowly gain a foothold in more and more villages and then think further ahead. Let's watch the footage till the end, which really shows us, yes, once again, the Russians have suffered relatively heavy losses here in this tank attack, both from FPV kamikaze drones that are attacking them directly, and also from a number of other drones. We consistently see it from multiple different angles, which then proceed to drop these small grenades onto the already immobilized, which have been left behind, these immobilized Russian tanks. In the end, we see it clearly here. Yet another significant or complete loss of these very same Russian tanks that had been deployed. But that's acceptable for the Russians. They had specifically saved up these tank columns for this very mission, for this very season, a few hundred behind the front lines. They've been waiting there all this time, and when the order actually comes through, a tank column gets deployed to transport soldiers. And the Russians are absolutely aware that they'll lose a large portion of the deployed, as I said, quote-unquote armored buses in the process. And one reason the Russians are hardly using any more tanks is precisely this absolute dominance of drones in the Pokrovsk area. And right here, we have a very impressive piece of footage, I believe, from the Ukrainian perspective, which shows an entire drone swarm getting ready to head out on the hunt right now, either for Russian soldiers or for Russian tanks. And we're seeing here, this is what the sky looks like. You mustn't forget the vast majority of these drones are equipped either with an explosive charge on board that allows them to crash into a target, or they have these grenades strapped underneath them. They can drop them sequentially. And that's just a few seconds. We see the situation here, so there are repeated airstrikes from the Russian side, so we can see all these fires burning all around us. We actually observe that the sky is literally packed with drones, and that these drones are probably forming up and preparing right here to launch an attack somewhere between 5 and 10, maybe even 15 kilometers away, and to completely wipe out any Russian advances there. However, and this is crucially important, this situation exists for both sides. Not only do the Ukrainians have these drone swarms, the Russians also have drone swarms, which is why the Ukrainians can hardly move with vehicles at all anymore. We'll look at that later, what they attempt or what happens when they try to move with vehicles. The situation at Pokrovsk, and this is the last video we want to look at from the 25th. It looks something like this with the Air Assault Brigade, and we were also told this when we were on the ground there about a month ago. You can't get into the city with vehicles anymore. You can't even get near it, and we're seeing the weather is getting worse and worse. Autumn is just starting now, which means mud season is beginning. They have these vehicles here and are really trying to transport drones on them through this terrain. Transporting food, transporting fuel, everything you need directly at the front. There are also computers and so on. And that's just the kind of supply that has to be carried out now. We can see it here. Under the heaviest fire. That means the soldiers constantly have to stop with what they have, with wherever they want to go to the front position, and we're going to see that right now. Unfortunately, there are also casualties again and again. That means even during these logistics attempts, meaning while they try to support the front position with the most essential ammunition, which is what's needed there, they're being attacked the entire time, meaning the Ukrainians who are trying to get through these forests then suffer losses here themselves. And we're about to see just how difficult that is, because if you have a single soldier that can no longer walk by himself, you need 4 men to bring him back to the rear in order to get him to safety at the stabilization point and then further on to the hospital. The Ukrainians are doing this. Here we see the 4 who are busy right now. The Ukrainians are doing this, the Russians aren't. That's the huge difference. The Ukrainians have to commit vast numbers of troops just to retrieve their wounded. The Russians have no rescue chain, they have no capability or no interest in evacuating their deployed men, and that's precisely why we see an extremely high death rate among the Russians. For the Russians, it's about 1 to 2, meaning for every fatality there are only 2 wounded. For the Ukrainians, it's about 1 to 7, meaning for every killed Ukrainian soldier, there are 7 wounded. Why? Because they have a functioning rescue chain in place, and because they make every effort to evacuate these soldiers and save their lives, although unfortunately in many cases legs and similar limbs have to be amputated. So we are seeing this footage here near Pokrovsk from the Ukrainian side. We keep seeing these tremors that occur when one is under attack. And that's the massive problem facing the Ukrainians. We also just saw the wreckage of an armored Ukrainian vehicle, the Cossack type, I believe. That means you can see relatively clearly the Ukrainians have almost no possibility of deploying these vehicles near the front lines, so you have to use the very first vehicles. As we're seeing here, the logistics have to be carried 5 to 10 kilometers on foot to the front, and conversely, the wounded have to be carried 5 to 10 kilometers back from the front before you can then, we're seeing it now here, you can actually get into an armored vehicle for the first time. From the center of the Donetsk region, so around Pokrovsk, we're moving further into the southeast of Ukraine, though we're located a few kilometers southwest of where we were just before, specifically into that triangular area which is situated between the oblasts, with Dnipropetrovsk visible immediately on the upper left-hand side there. Zaporizhzhia on the southern side and Donetsk on the right side. I'll first try to quickly retrace the oblast borders here, and that by doing so they can really put the squeeze on Ukraine, trying to stretch their defenses thin by opening this new active front. It's a core part of their strategy to create major pressure points, believing this will complicate Ukraine's defensive posture and ultimately weaken their military stance across the entire region, forcing them to divert resources and attention to this critical area. By advancing further in Dnipropetrovsk, the Russians believe this can be best accomplished here because they are extremely strong on the right side in Donetsk, have an extremely large number of units, and because Ukraine is almost no longer present there in this part of the region, and that's precisely why they're launching this major westward offensive push at this strategic triangle. And once more, we can clearly see the difference between October 6th and the situation today, with the Russians having advanced again, pushing forward roughly 5 to 6 kilometers in this specific area. 6 kilometers in some places, but when you look at the overall situation entirely, perhaps we could quickly take a look at that now. In the replay, if we examine the entire situation as a whole, it's once again approximately 50 square kilometers that have come under Russian control in just 3 weeks. Let's look at this again and now examine the main focal points along the front line. First, we'll watch a video from Novomikhailivka. Novomikhailivka is a small suburb located here in the vicinity of Uspenevka, which was also successfully captured over a total period of approximately 3 weeks, where we haven't reported up to now, with about 6 other locations that have also fallen under Russian control. As we mentioned, we'll first watch a video from Novomikhailivka and then a video from Yegorivka. And Yegorivka, we can see here, is still being contested, but it remains under Ukrainian control. And why that's the case, we'll see right in the video. As mentioned, first the footage from Novomikhailivka, which will more clearly show us the sheer firepower the Russians are employing in this area. You always think, right, how can just 2 Russian soldiers end up occupying an entire town? Yes, of course, there are dozens of fires, bombs, shining glide bombs from planes, rockets from multiple rocket launchers, and then again and again. These fixed-wing drones, these kamikaze drones, they're being fired at all known Ukrainian positions there. That means from the Russian side, we can see it from here, which houses are inhabited by the Ukrainian soldiers, where they've taken cover, where they're defending. And then there are these massive attacks. We've just seen that. You can even fly right down into the basement. That also works because you have these fiber optic guided drones. You can see it relatively well here. This is the basement where you fly in. And what's more, it is entirely possible for the Russians to directly attack almost all of the Ukrainian soldiers who are present on the ground there. And we see it here attacking the logistics. That means all the vehicles the Ukrainians use to move back and forth and bring in new weapons and to evacuate their wounded, all of these vehicles are coming under attack in the region. So that in the end, when the Russians go in with their 2 or maybe 20 infantrymen straight into the position, there are hardly any defenders left alive before they actually commit their ground troops and move them forward into those positions, which is precisely what we are clearly observing right here in this current footage of the assault sequence. They move in and raise their flags. This whole sequence, as I said, footage from Novomikhailivka, I believe in the Zaporizhzhia region, a bit further south to be precise, are no longer proving to be a significant barrier for the advancing forces, who are able to cross them with relative ease due to their overwhelming firepower advantage. We just saw it. There's a small river running along there that they don't really play a big role for the Russians, because you can, here we see it, that here is something like the river delta, or rather the river's course, which runs along here. This whole area is not a major factor for the Russians, as they can systematically fight the Ukrainians, killing or driving out most, and then dodge almost unopposed enemy bombardment. We also saw it earlier in Rodinske. There they cross the river almost without enemy bombardment. And then occupy the villages and settlements on the other side, respectively. This whole thing, as I said, is a breakthrough in the Zaporizhzhia region. We must not forget that Zaporizhzhia was also completely annexed by Putin back in the autumn of 2022. Even though they currently only control about 70% of that territory, the Russians are trying to push further in this area and have this possibility of advancing from the western side, as well as, of course, from the east. Advancing from Donetsk, which they've pinpointed as one of their most favorable options, to gain as much ground as possible in that area. We had just been talking about another village, specifically Jehorivka, and you might have noticed that Jehorivka was very, very far to the west, and that, so to speak, only a short stretch of land led there. An occupied tongue, if you will, by the Russians to attack there. We see once again the Russian videos of them fighting in drone warfare against the wheel, a bomb drone, essentially how they are fighting the entire logistical system and how they eventually manage to gain a foothold here in Jehorivka. However, and we'll see this in a moment, it's just that these situations are not always a final outcome. Occasionally we can see, while we must pixelate some areas here as each soldier is being attacked by the Ukrainian side, we often have the situation that these relatively small units move in here, first rendered the village assault ready, expelled all Ukrainian forces, and is now positioned there. However, as we will see in the next video, the Ukrainians are indeed planning counterattacks. That they're saying, okay, right now, today, due to the weather or something similar, the Russians just can't fly with that many drones, maybe can't see us on the ground. And now we're seeing it here, there's the Ukrainian counterattack. That means the Ukrainian soldiers are then attempting the same thing, in this case from the 425th Battalion, to go in here to drive out the Russians with grenades from these individual houses, and then of course to raise their flag again. This whole thing has worked off and on over the past few months. I can recall about 10 instances where they managed to retake territory, where you just go in, quickly make the point, all right, we've got these 2 or 3 or 5 Russians here, and then you pull back out again. It was that kind of a quick, temporary, commando-style type of operation. Now we see the Ukrainian flag after retaking the village, but in the end, the entire dynamic is such that, as we're witnessing right here, you ultimately end up being forced back, and the Russians really had no other option but to allow them to take over the entire situation. This entire dynamic was something the Ukrainian side simply couldn't reverse. Finally, we want to go to the Kharkiv region in the northeast of Ukraine. Here too, the Russians are trying to gain a foothold, specifically along the entire border. Let's first take a look at the video from the small town of BILD-Lagezentrum. And in BILD-Lagezentrum as well, we're seeing it here from the Russian perspective, just a few kilometers behind the front line. People have also tried to gain a foothold there now. That means we can also see this here in these shots, actually. You can't always imagine it. Every single building in BILD-Lagezentrum, relatively far away from what we just saw, more than 200 kilometers north of Pokrovsk, every single building has been completely destroyed. That means the Russians have also deployed a massive amount of firepower here every single day. It's almost unimaginable, relentlessly and systematically over the past months, to attack the Ukrainian defenders in every single building, to completely destroy all possibilities of finding any kind of shelter here. And now we see it. These are Russian soldiers who are here, at least establishing an initial presence. For how long, we don't know again. We just saw it. Some flag bearers are killed shortly after, and now here, showing that they've advanced further into the Kharkiv region as well. I'm quite sure they've managed to advance several kilometers into the country and can now at least report that success back to Moscow from this location. Yes, we have the so-called buffer zone, meaning this zone that Russia wants to establish in Kharkiv and also wants to establish in Sumy, is being planned to be extended a bit further. And it is important to note that Kharkiv was not annexed. That means Russia is essentially attacking beyond the annexed territories, just stating that for whatever strategic reasons they might have behind these actions. Yes, but the Ukrainians are still in danger, even in areas Putin hasn't claimed, which forces them to keep advancing there. And we can see that quite clearly here on this map, once again depicting the overall situation as of October 6th. To the north lies Russia's Belgorod region, home to the city of Belgorod with 300,000 people. And we can see that this vast area is Kharkiv, featuring the million-strong city of Kharkiv itself, which also includes the entire oblast, meaning the large administrative region that begins right here. And we can see the Russians are attacking from Luhansk, from the east, but it's really crucial for them to establish this kind of defensive line in this location. We can now observe that this defensive line was already initiated again in Lipsy. We recall here north of Kharkiv in Vovchansk, where they had already established it the previous year. And now they're trying to bring this entire area, which we've just seen here, under Russian control. The Russians claim it's a buffer zone, but realistically we can say wherever the Russians are able to advance, they will advance further. So they won't stop at this yellow line I just drew, but they'll keep advancing as far as they can until the Ukrainians put up too much resistance or resist too fiercely. And what we just saw were the recordings from BILD-Lagezentrum, and now we're going to go back to the current day. So from October the 6th, we are now transitioning over to today's current date. And on the deep state map, we once again observe a very strongly pro-Ukrainian organization. That this so-called buffer zone, or at least this occupied belt here, has expanded, has lengthened, and that the Russians have managed to bring more villages along the border under their control. However, just one last time to really hammer this point home, the notion that the Russians will eventually stop is pure propaganda, because we can clearly see a bit further south right here in Zaporizhzhia that they are advancing across a broad front. This signifies they are attempting to advance many kilometers westward, deep inside the Kharkiv region. That means we can assume that if the Ukrainians now withdraw from a location such as Ugrody, the Russian army will then proceed to push further into the country's interior, into the Kharkiv region. Finally, we want to look at two videos that prove, completely independent of the region, how the war is currently progressing. On the one hand, we have a very impressive video from the Ukrainian army, which shows us the attack on so-called loitering munitions. And we can see this very new Russian technology here, which is also quite easy to identify by its shadow. This is one of those fiber optic guided drones, which, because of the fiber optic cable attached to the back, can also land in between various locations and across different types of terrain. So that means the drones don't need to be in the air. They don't require a direct radio link to their operator. They can land in between and then wait on the ground for up to 6 hours by simply keeping their camera on and watching for when a Ukrainian vehicle passes by, when a civilian or a soldier comes along, when they can target them. That means these drones are now deployed by the thousands, posing an extreme and direct threat to Ukrainian forces on the ground. They can wait patiently for hours, remaining completely still, and strike the instant an enemy target comes into their view. They become active. That's why the Ukrainians are constantly searching their own streets under their own control to locate these drones and destroy them accordingly. And this is made especially simple by using what are known as bomber drones, which then fly over the area and release the specific grenades directly onto the targets. We'll briefly see the footage now, followed immediately by numerous attacks on these loitering munitions. Here we see it. So this is one of the recordings, or rather one of the attacks. And what's quite interesting to see is what happens next, namely that this fiber optic cable there, we see it, which has probably already flown 5 or 10 kilometers to that point. However, we see that there are another 10 kilometers inside it, that it's flying off to the side and that it's extending there, so to speak. That's actually the communication link which connects directly to the apparatus itself, and it covers both the video controller's functions and the flight capabilities of this specific drone. That means this long cable lying there, which is probably still 10 kilometers long. Whoa, we can see very clearly now. You don't see that kind of thing too often. We're currently observing further attacks on these drones, and we can also see just the sheer number of them waiting there on these roads. Sometimes we can even see them right there on the roads where they've grouped together. That means the Russians are also sending them out in whole swarms, sometime in the morning as soon as visibility allows, and then they position themselves side by side, just waiting and lurking on those very same roadways there. Every now and then you see the grenades missed by a few meters, but then there are secondary explosions from the respective drones. That's also quite interesting. The Russians do that very often too, that you simply use obstacles. That means here we probably see a Ukrainian tank barrier. Here we already see a destroyed Ukrainian vehicle. That means the Russians then wait exactly at this spot because they know the Ukrainians have to drive that way if they take the road. And accordingly, that's an ambush they're planning, which, however, is now being thwarted in this case. What I had just mentioned are these unbelievable quantities of loitering munitions in some cases. And again, if we take another quick look, here we see it. So these are at least 2 or 3 drones that are side by side here. I think you can see it. So here's the first one, up there is the second, and in just a moment we'll see it in the wide shot. There's a third one waiting right beside it. And that's why you constantly need more drones. Here's another look at it. So that's number 1, number 2, and number 3, all positioned right there. They're operational, each with an operator. You have to really picture it. So there's someone sitting in a bunker or in an occupied house looking into their screen and waiting, but also to actively engage, hunt down, and systematically destroy them, thereby neutralizing the persistent and ever-present threat they pose to the entire logistical supply chain, the safe movement of personnel, and the overall operational integrity of the front lines, thereby at least mitigating the immediate and direct threat posed to all those supply vehicles we saw earlier coming through the area. But Russian drones aren't just lurking on the ground. Many of them, especially the FPV models, are airborne and can travel for many kilometers. In this regard, we have new Ukrainian footage here, which also shows the ongoing battle being waged against the Russian drones. Initially, we see a Lancet drone that was attacked in this instance by what's known as an interceptor, a defensive drone of the Ukrainian army, typically a small quadcopter that actively pursues and intercepts these larger drones. They have up to 70 kilometers of range and are then taken out of the sky. Now we're seeing a Molniya, another Russian kamikaze drone. We can see it quite clearly here. The Russian pilot, sees exactly what he is doing. Fortunately, he is unable to look upwards. And here we can see the large explosive device that has been installed on it. And here you can even see 2 propellers now, so they're really playing it safe to make absolutely certain the device can cover a good distance. So we see these drones are being attacked again and again by day and by night. So the Ukrainians absolutely must be extremely careful to keep their own airspace as clean as they possibly can, both on the ground and up in the air. Extend to quite considerable distances, thereby enabling it to pose a substantial threat from afar. Even from very long range, which allows it to strike targets deep inside Ukrainian territory without being immediately detected. Whether that's the case here, I don't know, but sometimes several hundred kilometers. That means we see the defensive battle of Ukraine remains extremely difficult. It's being fought on the ground and in the air, and unfortunately in the last few days, Russia has managed to advance slowly but surely on the ground and continues to